All right, well, I thank everybody for showing up today, and I thank the Law and Society Association. My name is Dr. Roger Roots. I'm an attorney in private practice, and I do research on a variety of things, including jury rights and constitutional history. What got me into this topic is the constitutional aspect of the Citizens United debate and the reaction to the Citizens United decision. I started to sort of, begin sort of a typical, maybe a law review kind of approach. And then I realized, this is really more of a study of a social movement. There is a social movement to overturn the Citizens United ruling by the Supreme Court of 2010. And that movement has proposed some rather radical proposals, including amending the Constitution, which I regard as probably the most extreme kind of thing you can do to overturn a Supreme Court ruling. I should say that this isn't just one proposed 28th Amendment. There have been actually a dozen different proposals with different wording. Each one has slightly different wording, intended to overturn the Citizens United ruling from 2010. And I should say they actually go a lot farther. Even the most mild proposal actually will overrule Citizens United and many, many other cases, including at least the Buckley v. Vallejo decision and all those cases that extended from 1976, Buckley v. Vallejo. So every one of the proposals will go much, much farther than simply overturning Citizens United. Here's one that was introduced by Congressman Richard Nolan of Minnesota in 2013. No rights for artificial entities. Basically, they're all sort of truncated around these two proposals. Number one, corporations aren't people. Corporations have no constitutional rights. You can see the language, shall have no rights. No corporation shall have any rights under the Constitution. By the way, that isn't even really the holding of Citizens United. I mean, that idea is sort of a line of jurisprudence going back generations, hundreds of years, really. The idea of corporate personhood is hundreds of years old. It would overturn vast amounts of case law and legal understandings, really constitutional understandings, going back centuries. You can realize very quickly if corporations had no constitutional rights. I mean, this would allow the sheriff to bulldoze Disneyland, set fire to the Sierra Club, burn down the NAACP offices, raid the any corporation, business or nonprofit. Just the scope and the scale of these proposals is stunning. And of course, then there's the second proposition, which is this idea of separating money from speech. Money is not speech. We've all heard this. And of course, that was a big thing from the 1976 Buckley v. Vallejo decision. So there's this counter argument that money is not speech. And of course, it doesn't take long before you realize, wait a minute, it's very difficult to separate those two. We're all familiar with the McCarthyite sort of interrogatory. Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Well, there was an immense First Amendment movement from what I would call the left in America, the ACLU side, the First Amendment side of American constitutional understanding, to try to get some fundamental first principles of the First Amendment settled. But today, it's the American left that is pushing toward a new envisionment of the First Amendment, so that the subcommittee, the House On-American Activities, could simply ask the question, are you now or have you ever been a contributor to the Communist Party? They would get to the same exact place under a different theory. And it's really stunning when you think about this. This is the proposed 28th Amendment that went the farthest so far. This actually got a majority vote in the US Senate a few months ago. And it's a little bit milder in tone, a little bit watered down, a little bit tempered. It doesn't say shall regulate, it says may regulate. Congress and the states may regulate. It doesn't say that corporations or artificial entities have no rights. It just says the Congress and the government essentially shall have power to implement and enforce this article, including by prohibiting such entities from spending money to influence elections. A little bit watered down. This actually got a majority vote. Every single Democrat in the U.S. Senate voted for this to amend the Constitution. Every single Republican voted against it. It got a 54 to 46 vote. Of course, that's not enough to amend the Constitution. Article 5 of the Constitution. It requires that if you're going to amend the Constitution in that way, remember there are 4 different ways to amend the Constitution, but if you're going to do it in that way, you need a 2/3 majority vote in each chamber, the Senate and the House. And a lot of people say, well, you don't have to be worried about the First Amendment being amended away that easily. It's not going to happen. They won't get a 2/3. I frequently run into this. Don't worry, don't panic. It's never going to happen. They're not going to get a 2/3 majority. And I would counter to say this. This movement has a string of victories, and there is almost no pushback. There is not much of a counter movement. You don't hear a large movement right now defending Citizens United. It's one of the most widely detested, if you look at popularity polls, one of the most widely, when you ask people on the street about the Citizens United decision, I've seen 80 and 90% want it gone, want it overturned. There is almost no movement on the ground. Here you see protesters, overturn Citizens United. I actually would say most of these people probably haven't even read Citizens United. But there is no protesters on the ground anywhere. You can't even find a photograph of a protester defending Citizens United. Here's some more protesters. Senator Bernie Sanders, socialist from Vermont, currently running as the running for the Democratic nominee for president. You see this bombastic language. Quote, the major issue of our time is whether the United States of America retains its democratic foundation or whether we devolve into an oligarchic form of society where a handful of billionaires are able to control our political process by spending hundreds of millions of dollars to elect candidates who represent their interests. There are hundreds of quotes just like this. It's almost more, the more shrill and the more bombastic, the more your outrageous quote will be sort of broadcast as if that's what the impact of Citizens United is doing to American politics. This is Professor Lawrence Lessig of Harvard Law School. Corruption is everywhere. And of course, no one disagrees with that. I certainly don't. The American government is absolutely, fundamentally corrupt. No one would disagree with that. The question is it corrupt in the way that he says it's corrupt? He is one of the leaders, Professor Lessig of Harvard Law School, and he's started a movement, and he has the Root Strikers and some other organizations to overturn Citizens United and get the money out of politics. Is it the money that's making government corrupt? I was speaking on this issue on a local talk radio show, and I said something like, every person has a fundamental right to spend money to persuade. And a caller called in and said something like, well, that sounds a lot like bribery to me. And you know, he might have got the better part of that exchange. He sort of, wow, okay. But afterward, I got to thinking about that. It's nothing like bribery. It's not even close to bribery. Bribery is where you can make sure that the bribed person stays bribed. The vote is a secret ballot. You cannot bribe a voter. If you show me a voter who claims he's been bribed, I will show you either an utter fool or a liar. You cannot bribe your way to victory in an election. Here's another one of these bombastic quotes. This came out immediately after Citizens United in The Nation magazine, which of course is a magazine that has suffered horribly under censorship movements over the last century. House Un-American Activities investigated The Nation magazine constantly. J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI constantly investigating and seeking to censor The Nation magazine. Now they're fully for amending the First Amendment and amending the Constitution and giving government more power over broadcast and speech and print. Quote, the Citizens United decision by a Supreme Court majority of conservative judicial activists is a dramatic assault on American democracy, overturning more than a century of precedent. By the way, that in itself is, you have to stack inference upon inference to get to that claim. In order to give corporations the ultimate authority over elections and governing. This decision, said The Nation magazine, tips the balance against active citizenship by making it possible for the nation's most powerful economic interests to manipulate not just individual politicians and electoral contests, but political discourse itself. Just think of this. I mean, again, I could point to 100 different quotes similar to this. And the more I research this, the more I have to conclude that every single component of this narrative is false. Every single component of this narrative is false. The issues, the holding, the very ruling about Citizens United and what that case actually stood for